All right, shall we start? Okay. All right, we're going to start. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for being here. Thanks a lot for your attendance. Just a brief introduction to Lydia Kallipoliti. She's an architect, engineer, and a scholar whose research focuses on the intersections of architecture, technology, and environmental politics. She's currently an associate professor at the Cooper Union in New York and the author of two very, very relevant books, The Architecture of Closed Worlds and Histories of Ecological Design, which is the one that she's presenting today. She's been exhibited, published, awarded, and widely, including the Venice Biennale, the Istanbul Design Biennale, the Shenzhen Biennale, Oslo Architecture Triennale, the Lisbon Triennale, the RABA in London, the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, and the London Design Museums. She's also the head of Anacycle Research Think Tank and head co-curator of the 2022 Tallinn Architecture Biennale. Lydia Kallipoliti holds a diploma in architecture and engineering from the University in Thessaloniki in Greece, a Master of Science from MIT, and a PhD from Princeton University. And today she will be, I'm going to introduce you what she's going to be talking about, because she's going to do a much better job than me. But essentially she's going to be presenting this fantastic book that I strongly recommend to you. And we're super, super thankful for having you here. Thanks a lot, Lydia, and welcome.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Roger. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you. My friends are on the third row. My very dear friends. Eva, who made the connection with Elisava, and Areti, with whom I co-curated the biennial. So it feels like a family gathering. So in that context, I will present this book that just came out. It is intentionally positioned as an unfinished encyclopedia, not encyclopedia, and Histories of Ecological Design. And if we look at the term ecological design, it's a very recent term. It was coined only in 1996 in a book that was published by Sim van der Inn and Stuart Cowan. And what they argued for was that ecological design was basically a seamless integration of human activities with natural processes to minimize destructive environmental impact. But what I'm arguing in this book is that instead of this definition, which is reliant on the notion of integration, ecological design is not really a call to fit harmoniously with the natural world, but an interest in reproducing natural systems. And in this book, I'm presenting different worldviews and definitions of natures as constructs, as cultural artifacts, and how the laws of nature and metabolism are displaced from the domain of wilderness and transposed to the domain of cities, buildings, and objects. So ecological design has signified not just the integration of the design object of space in the natural world, but also the process of reproduction of the natural world in design principles and tools through technological mediation. I'm hoping I can change the slide, but oh, there it is. All right, so the book has basically 21 chapters, and it is divided in 3 eras, and it presents conflicting definitions and concepts of architects and designers and the parallel histories of their intellectual positions toward environmental thought from the 19th century to the present, in an unfinished cyclopedia of 21 chapters. The book examines different natures as fabrications and cultural artifacts and showcases that ecological design starts with the reconceptualization of the world as a complex system of flows rather than a discrete compilation of objects that György Kepes, that was a visual artist at MIT, and his mentor was Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, has described that was the most fundamental reorientation of the 20th century. So in the book, which was designed by Post-Spectacular Office, and these are their schemes for each one of the chapters, there are 3 periods that are covered. Naturalism, which starts from the coining of the word ecology by Ernst Haeckel in 1866. Synthetic naturalism, which starts from the view of the whole Earth, the public image of the whole Earth, which spurred different notions of environmentalism. And dark naturalism, which is the current period that we're living in, which coincides with the contested term of the Anthropocene. So if we look at the first period, and these are 2 drawings by Ernst Haeckel in the 19th century, where trees become artifacts to order the world. And this is the kind of evolutionary tree, and this is a different version of it, where you have a kind of ascending from men. I don't know how to use it very well, I'm sorry. I was trying to point something. Oh, there, pedigree of men. So it starts from men all the way down to bacteria. So it presents a very hierarchical condition of ordering life, which has been subject to racial biases, and it coalesces in this period, which presents this whole series of chapters, a critique of the deeply ingrained anthroposophical perception of nature since the Enlightenment. And in Ernst Haeckel's genealogical trees, which, like other vegetal representations, they have been instrumental in the history of ecology, because the tree gave form to the colonial project of domination over nature. Trees also forecast a world order that rests on an evolving hierarchical society that begins from man on the top, and as we said, going all the way to bacteria in the bottom. So the diagrammatic visual structures that we use, like how we order things, how we create hierarchies and visualize these, like using a plant or a tree, they seem at first apolitical and ahistorical, but they actually uphold power and privilege by positioning certain species, organisms, and populations in the margins or lower ranks of such representations. The bifurcation of trees not just implies linear progress, but also establishes an order and assigns value to all components of life, rearranging living things into ladders, centers, and niches, generating and maintaining social hierarchy. So the origins of ecological design are rooted in a profound desire to idealize the anatomy of natural elements based on a natural order. As art historian T.J. Demos has argued, ecology's disciplinary formation coincided with the height of European colonialism, a regime not limited to the governing of peoples only, but also to the structuring of nature. So instead of understanding ecology and ecological design as this very, let's say, naive practice of integration with nature, we can also see it as a science of empire. So if we move forward, if we would move it's there. I have 2 different presentations. That's why I'm so confused. But maybe I'll just sit here and I'll speak out of... Okay, got it. So synthetic naturalism, this is a section which is very interesting and important to mark the second period. It is drawn by the sociologist John McHale, who was working with Buckminster Fuller. And it's very interesting because it's the first time that historically, usually we understand, I did it again. We usually understand, let's say, architecture in this level of sea level here, but he was saying that human activity has infiltrated in the deep section of the world and all the way to the stratosphere. And in many ways, this section presents a different kind of colonial project of domination, of world planning, of reproducing and understanding world planning and the stage set of the planet itself as a different kind of building or territory that is to be designed. So unlike the argumentation of Sim van der Rijn and Stuart Cowan, which demonstrated a deep appreciation of nature's equilibrium, ecological design began with the synthetic replication of natural systems. And now I'm having exactly the same problem. So going to the third period, this is a visualization. It's not an actual photograph, but it is the accumulation of space debris outside of the Earth. And it's a visualization. It's not real, but you could never actually get an image of this because light never is at the right position to acquire such images. And it shows how the waste that we produce has become a kind of condition of living within ruins that is also exported outside of the Earth. And I'm using the term not Anthropocene, but Thulucene, which comes from Donna Haraway's literature, which is, it has the dark dimension of the underground, that we live, that the turn of the 21st century marked a new era in environmental debates, discernible in the eradication of what was earlier regarded as natural, and the naturalization of a perpetual climate crisis, also a widespread toxicity residing not just in the planet, but also within human and non-human bodies. So as if we think of how Derrida argued for the evolution of language and culture, which are not given, but instead constructed through historical and social processes, these developments are also naturalized. Severe environmental degradation is naturalized, and it is presented as canonical and inevitable, as the natural evolution of technological and cultural advancements. This distortion of the problem at stake is why critical discourses in ecological design are vital to the reform and rebuilding of renewed alliances and hierarchies, and the term may imply, in fact, the loss of all things natural. In this new material and existential condition, ecological design is not only directed to the ethics of the world's salvation and the rhetoric of confinement, but it gives rise to diverging positions that displace humans as protagonists in ecosystemic equations. So this long and varied history, and this is something that you can see in the book, is presented in the plural form, unapologetically, in a series of narratives that form a matrix of open associations and threads that are read in non-linear ways. The hope is that this unfinished cyclopedia may produce new interconnected narratives, a wayfinding of environmental worldviews. So you can see how it is suggested that you can read the book from taxonomy, let's say, to below, but you can also follow the thread, which is prompted at the end of each chapter, and go to another chapter along a thread. And I'm going to present two of these threads today. So this wayfinding was not a very easy thing to do or a straightforward thing to do, and I was for years changing it and revising it, and there was chaos for years while discussing my reservations of this book with my mentor, Tony Vidler, who passed away recently this year. I told him that this book was, to me, a gigantic constipation that I felt for years. And he kept asking me to write it and carry on, as the British would say. He was from England, and insisted that these histories need to be written as parallel stories of many different worlds. Now, the story behind it is that in 2016, Oxford English Encyclopedia of Environmental Science asked me to write the history of ecological design in 3 periods for an online encyclopedia that would be accessible to everyone, not just architects, but every discipline. So while researching, I faced a problem of how do you write when basically you cannot take one argument You cannot take a critical position and perspective and go along with it, which is what scholars were trained to do. But you have to convert yourself to like a tentacular creature. And again, I'm using Haraway's literature. And this is her photograph of a softbot where you actually approach a story from many, many different directions. So it was comforting to me in that line of thought. When I read Foucault's text, What is an Author? I actually got that from Eva, that text, or The Death of an Author, and his words that writing is linked to sacrifice and a voluntary obliteration of the self. The work itself, when you write, attains the right to kill, to become the murderer of its own author. So there are many objectives, I have to say, in the revision of the printed book that might circulate in your hands. One was to emphasize the parallel histories of different environmental worldviews. Another major one was to decolonize notions of environmentalism and open the content to produce a historiography that empowers historically disenfranchised narratives. There's also an acknowledgement and a critique from the beginning that ecological histories reflect, in one way or another, hierarchical modalities of domination, ones that are bent on controlling knowledge and shaping the physical and material world into ontological and scientific worldviews. Architects and designers have long been complicit in the hubris of this position, that as humans, as caretakers of the planet, the self becomes a distinct biological individual entity and possesses the power to analyze the world, devise hierarchies, and construct ideological cosmologies that become norms. Today, at a time when neoliberal governmentality and ethics is hopefully questioned, it is crucial to acknowledge that this kind of history is a deeply rooted extractive colonial project. Despite this disclaimer, the book does not offer alternative indigenous histories. Rather, it reassesses the values entrenched in various perceptions of ecological design as an ideological instrument and as a didactic structure. Andrea Branzi, who I really liked from the 70s onward, mentioned that nature is not necessarily a physical entity or a neutral and free structure, but a general product that must be wrapped to create an image of itself, a product of thought and ideology. It's also important to mention, and these are images from an exhibition about the book that was displayed at the Cooper Union this past month, that along with writing, which to me is one form of research, all the different chapters were illustrated in these drawings that I've worked with illustrator Yoon-Min Shin to produce them. And the drawings are produced by using iconic images as archival citations to create a kind of composite image for each chapter. So they become constellations, the drawings of specific archival objects and images in the content of each chapter. So for example, this one, you see how different stories that I'm describing in the chapter become part of also a visual narrative, and the correlation of these two different forms of representation are approaching the subject in different ways. So today I will examine, there it is, the red. I will examine two threads. So the first one is the thread of what I call the climate project. And the climate project starts from the acclimatizers going to the climaticists in the mid-20th century and to the concept of resilience, which is a kind of line that everybody uses today. And in the illustration was inspired by this painting, which is a painting of a famous story. It's called Mutineers of the Bounty. And the painting was 1790 by Robert Dodd. And it's a famous story that this bounty, that there was a mutiny and ships were carrying different objects to colonial territories. But what's less known is that one of the most valuable objects that were being transferred were plants. And you see here the plants in this drawing. So these ships, some of them were called floating gardens or floating forests. And they wanted the plants because that was a very key ingredient to the evolution and the shaping of territories in the colonial lands. So in that chapter, I'm speaking about the Wardian case, which is what you see on the left, which is the device that enabled, basically, the geoengineering of territories, the Wardian case, which was an early type of terrarium, a closed, transportable, small-scale greenhouse that became the critical technological medium that revolutionized plant transference and colonization. Without this object, colonization would not be possible because living organisms would die at sea from long exposure to sea journeys. Now, plant transference was absolutely critical to colonial territories that became, in effect, bioengineering laboratories soon after they were discovered, and places where new ideas about health, acclimatization, and climatic improvement were put into practice in spatial design enterprises. The premises of these tests were at times based on unfounded hypotheses that the erasure of the existing climate would become a better environment for the settler colonialists. Bioengineering attempts to clear the savage primeval ground took many forms. For example, the Bavarian architect Hermann Schorgel in 1928 constructed dams that would drain the Mediterranean Sea to create artificial lakes in Sahara in order to improve the African climate and create new land for European exploitation while generating hydroelectric power. But if we go from this image, which is something like in the 18th century, to this one, which is something in 2018, the connections become very pertinent. And this is the new headquarters of Amazon in downtown Seattle that was constructed by NBBJ architects in 2018. And they constructed tropical climates and different kind of biomes inside these environments, these spherical leisure spaces. And there was a huge capital investment. They hired a horticulturalist who would grow the plants from different sections of the earth, about 5,000 rare plants, and they would transfer them directly to the office work because they found out through a 2013 study that workspaces that include office plants lead to a 47% boost of employee well-being, a 45% boost of creativity, and a 38% boost of productivity. So based on this study, they evaluated that they would get better workers, more productive workforce, and they continued on that plan, which is something that we can completely criticize and be horrified with. But what is really interesting is that this very overt control and bioengineering of climate happens in everyday life and in the everyday interior. This is not necessarily everyday life. This is Jacques Tati's famous movie, Playtime, but it speaks to the construction of a calibrated, weather-controlled interior that subsequently creates conditioned subjects for specific climates and is entangled with the feats of exploration and colonization. It also marks, however, the unremarkable experience of everyday life. So in many ways, we're already part of a universal acclimatization experiment, and based on a 2018 study of the Environmental Protection Agency, Americans spend 90% of their time indoors, and that was a kind of statistic that was before the pandemic. So one of my favorite drawings that was also very important to my previous book is the presence of psychrometric charts. And these are engineering drawings. Basically, between the red and the yellow line, you have what is defined as the comfort zone, which has a specific amount of moisture within the air in a specific temperature. And this is what regulates this room, every room that we know of, every room that we build, but it is something that we don't discuss as architects, and something that basically we are somehow detached from that logic. So the comfort, the idea of comfort, this is a very early psychrometric chart from Carrier Corporation. This is the guy that invented it. And in a way, it universalizes the idea of comfort. You know, me and you and a man and a woman and a pregnant woman feel very different in these spaces. However, the psychrometric chart universalizes and standardizes these things. And their efforts have been systematized in the 80s through Azrahe and different kind of standards. And they really create a predictable behavior and growth for bodies in interior spaces. So this was kind of little model that I did for the Venice Biennial of 21, kind of redrawing the space of Jacques Tati in psychrometric chart. But it really becomes a representation that the idea of comfort was fulfilled through the monitoring of building performance, foreshadowing a new modernist ethos where humanist values could be quantified. Now, in this story, it is important to see how these are two very, very interesting diagrams. This is from Victor Olguillet, Men as a Central Measure in Architecture. And this is from another guy that was a professor at Columbia, James Marston Fitch, that wrote the book, The Third Environment. They were almost parallel, maybe a decade apart. But in this drawing, the Vitruvian man, which is a kind of representation that subscribes what is the ideal, let's say, body into geometry, is now resubscribed into a perfect climate. And I think it's very interesting to see how, if you read that book, which is a very important precedent, let's say, for bioclimatic architecture, they really talk about freeing men so that they can become more productive, which is a neoliberal perception of life, that we always have to be productive. And we must be freed through the regulation of climate that spends tons of energy in order to become productive. So, and in this case, which is Fitch's case, he was a little different. He wasn't as, let's say, the seed of neoliberalism as the Olguillets were, but he was understanding architecture as a third environment that kind of mediates bodily conditions to environmental conditions, and it becomes this membrane and layer. And he speaks of it as a third environment. But it's interesting to see that these ideas that became very important to architects in the mid-20th century were kind of coming from notions of climate determinism and climatology, where there was a university professor that believed that climate, a Yale University professor called Ellsworth Huntington, who was a geographer, and he was the father of climate determinism, who maintained that the general distribution of civilization and progress depends largely on climate. Now, the legacy of these ideas becomes evident in the modern interior, and the language of modern architecture becomes the formal language to express this kind of control of the climate. And these are the drawings by a Greek architect for his residence in Kavouri, Athens. His name was Konstantinos Dekavalas, and the house was completed in 1971. But the research was done at Columbia University in the 1950s. He was a student of James Marston Fitch. And he, upon graduation, along with other students, they founded the Climate Informed Research Group, and they worked on a number of techniques in order to process airflows and create different kinds of microclimates. Here you see that the idea of modern domesticity in this book in the 1940s, which was by George Nelson, who was a famous industrial designer, and Henry Wright, was really about, they, in their own words, describe it as being alone with nature, but in a controlled environment and luxury conditions. So hence, we see this drawing for climate control in the modern interior of Konstantinos de Cavallas with the perfect man, which was taken from a movie at the time, The Perfect Human, and becomes, that flourishes within the right climatic conditions. So moving on to a different thread right now, we're going to read the House Project. But the House Project is very curious. It starts from the project of domestic economy in the 19th century, going to the idea of autonomy, the liberation of energy, from the kind of autonomy where a house creates energy and becomes liberated from the tentacles of power supply in society, and the category of the non-humans. And what's really interesting to me about this thread, the Home Project, is that the Home Economist chapter features exclusively female domestic reformers of the 19th century, and I will explain to you why. So a marginalized subject for the 19th century, and the non-humans, which is now a marginalized subject. So it really speaks about who is to be housed and what is domesticity. And these are the kind of three drawings that correlate with these three chapters. And you will see they're kind of different. This is, oops, not very good at this is, we'll see the domestic economy, but most of these illustrations come from Catherine Beecher, and this is a very different kind of category that relates to the counterculture and the idea of producing energy by material decomposition, and this is about non-human elements. So going to the Home Economy Project, a very important landmark book was The American Woman's Home, or Principles of Domestic Science, and that was in 1869. And Beecher imagined the house as an independent, autonomous unit that would be operated and managed without external help, run exclusively by the housewife. Both Beechers were anti-slavery proponents, so they were really active abolitionists in the United States because they considered that any domestic labor should be done by a collaborative or a group, and there is no need of distinction, although they never voted. But they advocated for the creation of an independent domestic unit that would serve as the basis of a democratic society, and they urged women to educate themselves in all matters of domestic management, especially hygiene, proper ventilation, general health, as well as medical explanations and anatomical illustrations of the human body. So it's very interesting to see that these reformers were not just writing advice, but they were also engineers. And in fact, they are acknowledged as the first domestic engineers, first by Siegfried Gideon in Mechanization Takes Command in the early 20th century, and then by Rainer Banham, who eventually draws, well, actually, it is his wife that drew it, but this house was the kind of an illustration of the American woman's home that Banham asked his wife, Mary Banham, to draw. So they aspired to optimize environmental conditions, and they became very proficient in analyzing and reinventing the mechanics of housing typologies, as well as their infrastructural layout. Indeed, they condemned the ignorance of architects and men in general of these subjects and proposed their own air duct models, such as scientific domestic ventilation, concluding that a wise woman is indispensable for building a house. in The American People Starved and Poisoned in 1886, Beecher pointed to the health-related dangers that arise when little or no consideration is given to problems of heating, ventilation, and storage. And another important character to kind of continue this debate is this woman, Ellen Swallow Richards, who was the first woman to graduate from MIT in 1900. You see all the kind of men in the chemistry. And she was really interested in the term ecology. And it comes from a Greek word, ekos, ecology, but before her, Haeckel used it, and he coined it as the house of nature. So she contacted Haeckel to request his permission to use the term with an amended meaning. And it's also interesting to see that in her cooking and cleaning manuals that she was writing, it was all chemical processes. There were never recipes, but all of them were equations, which was extraordinarily fascinating to see. But there was a disagreement between Haeckel and Swallow Richards. Haeckel understood nature's household as a concept that originated from the German Naturschau, I can't speak German, so I'm bad at it, Naturhaushalt, and his focus did not fall on the house as a domestic environment, but on the relations between animals and their inorganic and organic environments. Swallow Richards, on the other hand, was interested in the health of a house as a concept that extended to the world at large. So she wanted to replace home economics with ecology, which was to be understood literally, a tool for combating ill health based on principles of environmental science and domestic management. She believed that the world should be kept up like any housewife should keep their home. Her initiative to promote home economics as a legitimate branch of environmental science was also a way of validating higher education for women. In her mind, and this is one of the first kitchens that she designed, the cleanup of the home and the environment was a way of ameliorating society itself. However, Swallow Richards' hope for ecology quickly evaporated when in the British Medical Journal in 1893, there was a definitive definition of the word ecology as a form of knowledge obtained from morphology and physiology. So all of these German white guys that were drawing plants, basically, chiefly resting on the exploitation of the endless phenomena of animal and plant life as they manifest themselves under natural conditions. The literary debate, basically between Haeckel and Swallow Richards, casts the word ecos, house, in different lights. Haeckel understood it as an outside, which was the house of nature, the concept of inhabiting the world, and it was correlating with the tradition of the naturalists of the 18th and 19th century, taking very long journeys, going to nature and collecting stuff and recording it in taxonomies, drawing it, and so forth, and putting them in cabinets of curiosities. For Swallow Richards, ecology was an inside. It referred to the life of domestic management linked to the health of its inhabitants. So she envisioned ecology as the projection of the interior to the outside world and a form of municipal housekeeping. This inside and outside dichotomy grew directly from an established gender division in the 19th century, the ideology of separate spheres, or the dichotomy between domestic and public, that John Ruskin declared that it was necessary for the preservation of a balanced society. In his text of Queen's Gardens, a lecture that he delivered in London in 1864, Ruskin insisted that the role of men was to be in the public realm and the public sphere and earn a living, while the role of women was to remain at home and maintain it as a sanctuary and a place of peace for men to return. Ruskin believed that it was this distinct, in his view, equal allocation of roles that ensured happiness and perfection to both genders. So such constraints directed those women of the middle and upper classes who participated in environmental activism not only to defend their activities as extensions of their roles as wives and mothers, but also to conceptualize their ideas of the environment as beginning at home and moving outwards, from the inside emanating to the outside. So thousands of women were drawn to home-related issues that fell under the banner of municipal housekeeping, such as ensuring safe air, food, and water for their families, or conserving nature to beautify their lives, enhance their recreational activities, and educate their children. So from this, we go to a very different version of autonomy. And still, we are examining autonomy related to self-governance and not to the autonomy discourse and architectural discourse. This was the countercultural movement kind of emanating from Britain in the 60s and 1970s. And this is the ecological house of Graham Kane and the Street Farmers. This is actually my favorite diagram of all times, because the architect is the one that poops, and the poop sustains life through the recirculation of resources. So in the 60s and 70s, autonomy became an ideational vehicle for fortifying the boundaries of disciplinary fields, but it was also used to popularize an ecological and libertarian way of living and acting, and to emancipate the inhabitant from the grid of urban supplies. This emancipation was understood in correlation to slavery in the 19th century household of the home economics. Here it is understood as a tool of political resistance to centralized authorities that are related to power supply, as these were formed in the tentacles of the power grid. So the house of basic interdependencies, which is the kind of title that he used off the grid, was linked to the individual's liberation from authoritative state mechanisms. And one of the things that he, along with a lot of other architects of that kind, they were interested in anarchist discourse at the time, and especially the ideas of Murray Bookchin and his vision for a societal transformation initiated by self-empowerment, which appeared on the cover of this magazine, Anarchy in London, in 1971. It featured the growth of new routes, the illustration that through the intelligent use of technology, people would be able to create or grow their own living environments detached from the power networks of the state's energy distribution. The individual could thus grow exponentially from the self outwards, a very similar kind of idea from the inside to outside, towards the fabric of the municipality. And here we have a kind of similar diagram of another house, the integral urban house, where that also heralded the idea of autonomy from energy supplies. So when speaking of the house of other species, animals, and non-human organisms, the notion of autonomy resurges also in Jacob von Uexküll's notion of Umwelt, a self-world which an organism composes, both perceptually and materially, to live inside and act as a subject. To construct the Umwelt, the organism must unify the external and internal forces of life into a single entity, or a new world that resides in a bubble. Von Uexküll's theories have been largely critiqued as discriminatory and racially motivated. Besides his actual connections with racial thinkers, and he was really connected with Houston Stewart Chamberlain, that was definitely a racial thinker, the Umwelt sets the stage for a world of controlled enclosures and autonomous milieus with no hope of exteriority. So just to conclude here, why did I call this book a cyclopedia and not an encyclopedia? This was a very important distinction for me, because in many ways, the cycling of ideas is a form of resistance to a project's linearity and causality, to encircle knowledge in definitive, complete patterns and narrate history as inevitable. Recycling histories, or offering these open threads, becomes a disruption to an idealized continuum, or a productive distraction to the arrow of time. I argue that the process of cycling knowledge differs substantially from encircling it. Cycling denotes a feedback loop of ideas and practices that circulate and travel in distinct orbits with definitive points of semantic gravity. It also suggests a journey rather than a singular critical perspective, one that enables voyages between different times, places, and objects. When a chapter is part of such a cycling process, we cannot be absolutely sure of whether it speaks of the past or the future, since in the history of ideas, resources get recycled. On the other hand, encirclement is a mental and political construct that allows all things to be incorporated into controllable and determined worldviews. But a circle is not a given figure on which power acts. The task of political action is to encircle and transform knowledge, organic life, and bodies into sovereign entities and instrumentalize them as modes of discourse and hegemonic power structures. As Ukrainian mineralogist Vladimir Vernadsky noted in the 1920s, if an organism is studied as something distinct from the cosmic milieu, it is not a natural body as it is, but a pure product of thought and ideology. But ecology is not one thing. Like water, it exists in various material states whose power can both instill and destroy life. Ecological design equally comprises a universe of fragmented worldviews and their constellations. It is a cloud of stories about human and non-human agencies and the ways in which they encounter the earth, correlate with its parts, nurture it, or are nurtured by it. Ecology is enveloped by ghosts and ideas of what the world should be, engineered fantasies of the interconnectedness of all things, circular reasoning, and the idealization of the natural. If ecological design is a kind of world making, then we must account what a world is and what a world is for. Thank you. Did I speak long? No?
Questions, anyone? Take advantage of Lydia being here.
Carson.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful lecture. I know the book, we've spoken about the book many times, but maybe I thought I'd ask a question as other people are gathering their thoughts. You mentioned that the book doesn't focus on indigenous thought,
Yes.
and instead on Western European and North American thinking. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about as well in terms of the research that I've been doing on environmental architecture. How might this project look differently if indigenous thought were to be included? Or why was it necessary to not include it for this specific project?
It wasn't necessary. It was just extremely hard to do that, because it's not recorded. And one of the things that we've been talking about, we had a decolonization task force at Cooper, and Tony Bidler was part of it before he passed. And we were just talking about the sheer lack of resources on material on indigenous culture, that one has to take an enormous journey like the 19th century German explorers and find this information because it has been excluded from history, right? So it's not that you can find any of this information from weird blogs online or go to an archive and find it. We're just not trained to do this kind of research, and it's mostly been recorded by anthropologists so far. But also, it's a different kind of project. I think it will take us years. It wasn't my intention to exclude it. It was absolutely, and there is a chapter on land narration and immersionists that I'm speaking about a lot of radical practices of decolonization, especially through the concepts of Afrofuturism and land narration. But also a lot of the older studies are quite anthropological field studies because they precede language. And there's a very different kind of recording of the findings of such processes, which doesn't correlate with language and grammar and code. So it's something that I just didn't know how to do, to be honest with you. And it takes a very special and focused study. There have been architects that have traveled. Julia Watson did a study on indigenous systems. There are other studies, and slowly there is work emerging in that field. But I think what's really interesting from the things that I read is, and this is something that I'm writing in that chapter of land narration, is the development of a new kind of sentience between different kinds of organisms, and a different understanding of the interconnectivity of different parts of the system. So, there are people, like I'm mentioning, Paulo Tavares and their project in Venice, about how a constructed environment for an indigenous, like that was very striking to me, and I analyze it, could be a forest, right? It's just using different means, and it's understanding a co-production of space with natural elements, which is a mental shift that we just haven't been equipped to deal with yet.
Thank you, Lydia, for the fascinating lecture. And somehow building on Carson's question, I really appreciate the, genuine gesture of consciously leaving aside this indigenous vision and in some way avoiding appropriation of this way of also explaining the world that somehow has been how Western academic environment has been operating. And I'm curious, and I also like you also accepting that you don't know how it will be to incorporate those visions, but now extending a bit, what will be the role of academia in this new position of allowing other visions, other cosmovisions to work the knowledge? Because, being from that side of kind of privilege is somehow comfortable to do these claims, but somehow accepting that maybe there are other views that we don't know how to register. How do you think?
We don't know how to.
How do you think academia will work in that new worldling landscape, let's say?
I think it goes hand in hand with the expansion of different mediums and forms of language to explore these kinds of scenarios. So let's say in the 1960s, everybody was like, oh, everything is architecture. Let's expand the discipline of architecture to things that are not just buildings, but environments and temperatures and conditions. I think if we are serious about this, we have to develop new kinds of representation that are not the canonical tools with which we represent space, right? Which is basically orthographic projections that haven't been altered since the Enlightenment. And it's a much more multimedia approach that explores narrative, embodied making, different notions of embodiment, which become really critical in this book, which I discuss, like what it means to understand ecological design as an embodied experience, not as an experience where spaces become instruments that are measured and calculated, but where people have a kind of sentience with environmental conditions. They exist within, and they're co-produced with the spaces. So I think it's years of work, because it has to do with how tools are established and default mechanisms for exploring ideas. It's a very hard thing to do, but very worthy.
Thank you.
The students are afraid.
No, they're afraid. That's why I'm trying to make it easy.
You can ask any question. It's not like...
Big sector? Not having any bias. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
I actually at one point didn't get something when you showed the slide of the Greek architect in the 70s of his like
Yeah.
interior, and you talked about the microclimates to create the microclimates and how that goes with the architecture. And my question was, how do you create microclimates in this architecture that is so open? Or did I get something wrong?
No. It's a very good question. The point was that basically this sketch, the drawings of this architect, and there are many drawings from other architects that are similar, is the beginnings of bioclimatic design, right? And that was pursued through tools, physical infrastructures that regulate airflow, basically, and regulate moisture. So when a downdraft ventilation movement comes, it creates in a certain kind of spatial condition, a certain kind of climate. And this is what they were doing. But what was very interesting is that they were doing it specifically in the modern interior, like the kind of modern interior with two flat ceilings. Well, sometimes there were oblique roofs. Don't get me wrong. And Carson is looking at me because he had in his exhibition oblique roofs, and there were. But the idea was that the modern interior would be a kind of luxury condition, kind of like a James Bond figure, let's say, in a perfect climate inside. And the tools were created for this kind of purpose of bioclimatic design, mostly. Not for, let's say, the houses of underprivileged populations that were too hot. You see what I mean? Like, so it was promoted as a lifestyle. That's the kind of story of the comfort zone. And I think it's important to see that and to acknowledge it and to see what else can be done. But also, it also kind of puts forward the idea that ecological design is a toolkit of stuff or apparatuses and machines that can be applied to any kind of design and measured on how they will perform. And that's also something that I'm trying to dismantle. Did I confuse you more? You're looking at me.
No. I'm actually getting.
Yeah? Okay.
Anyone else?
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you so much. So lovely to see some of many years of work to be finally materialized. I always admire you people, that's right, are able to do in a book. I think it's great. On the topic of quantifying humanistic values, I think that along the histories of ecological design that you're going through, the book and your research, there is definitely a connection with technology, right? How can we quantify if we don't have data and if we don't have the technology that we can control this kind of adaptation or change, no? So that we can basically hack, program, control the measures, the numeric values. So my question is rather more into a projection to the future, taking into consideration that we are at a digital explosion, at the moment of big data, at a moment that the ecological crisis is very much, first of all, diagnosed because we have the technology to have the data. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been aware of it. So how do you think that these new narrations that you're talking about can project into the future maybe another way of seeing ecology beyond data?
Yeah, you should not have asked this question in public because I don't know how to answer it. But it's a very important one. It's a very important question. And I have a kind of love and hate relationship with numbers, right? Because, and I'm not in any way or form saying that that technology is the enemy here, right? It's nothing of what I've shown is trying to allude to that argument. We are technology. We have technology in our bodies, so it's absolutely necessary and important. But I think we need to rethink how we use it in the discipline of architecture, design, and culture, because there was a major epistemic shift, I think, in the 80s, which was overlapping with the rise of neoliberalism and the kind of Thatcher/Reagan kind of regime of capitalist empowerment, where everything became about performance, and the ethos of modernism, which was about function, became about performance. And then we are at a moment right now that ecological design is understood as a quantification of a performance. So there is no formal and visual and cultural language that connects any of this together. This building can be described as LEED certified because of a detail, because it might have like 5 panels of solar panels in the roof. And I think that this is problematic in the way that we understand environments in architecture, and we need to rethink on how to create new kinds of relationships in social and natural systems. It doesn't mean that numbers are not important. It means that looking through numbers in a checklist of objectives is a problem. And that's what we have done. And I think that I was saying something similar with Carson in an interview. Like, Carson and I were in an interview recently for a magazine because he curated an exhibition at MoMA. And he said, I stopped in the 90s because it was the development of sustainability criteria, right? Before that point, there was no unified, homogenized language that would put together all of these principles and create a kind of list of components that need to be checked in order to get certification. Now there are so many different systems, and that's how it's understood, like through certificate A, certificate B, and so forth. And I think that to understand it differently, numbers are important. Like, we live in clouds of data. We have to account for them. Like, I think there was a study I was reading that 2 or 3% of the energies of the global energy consumption is based on sustaining data. So it's a really big problem that has a physical footprint on the world, how we maintain data, where we maintain it, and what kind of energy is needed to cool data centers and all that stuff that a lot of people are working on. But I think it's also very important to develop new narratives and new positions and new kind of languages of thought and avenues related to environments. Now, how to do that? Ongoing project.
I mean, I think the incredible contribution of your book lies in the method. And I think, the method in which you've developed the book and how you describe the cyclopedia versus the encyclopedia, I see it more as a kind of almost like an ecological model of history writing. And maybe in thinking in that way, we can eventually come up with some new ideas. I don't know if you want to talk more about this method, but I really see it as a kind of, the way that you talked about it as a non-linear kind of way of thinking about history seems to be more of an ecological model of thinking rather than teleological, historical one.
Hopefully.
Maybe just to build on that, because the first project that you did before a book was an online database. It was a website, right? It was an open source, fully accessible. And I'm talking more about, today we are in the presentation of a book. And a book is a medium, that has a particular purpose. It has a particular duration. It has a marking on time. It has a corporeality. It has the capacity, to bring people around the book. But you always started with an open source, with a history that could be written and rewritten. And you have opened up different ways of thinking about the writing of history, or of those histories in plural. What is the life of this book, and what is your thinking around your own ideas at the very beginning of your career of providing these open platforms for open access beyond the production of the book? Where is this knowledge continuing or going after it? And maybe that has to do with the same question that Carson was asking.
Yeah, that's the problem with having your friends that know you better than anybody asking you questions. I don't know. I think I can't think otherwise. Like I just think in different layers, and it's an inevitable for me to do this. I don't know if I can do the other way around, which is to write which was a problem with my dissertation. I had this huge argument with one of my two PhD advisors who wanted the chapters to be one leading to the other, all kind of constructed a kind of argument, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And it was 3 parts where there were different episodes in time that were going back in time, and then the chapters were correlating to the episodes, and one of the advisors was so confused that he was like, how can we epistemologically define this as a PhD? And I haven't solved it, but I think I can't work otherwise, like, to be honest. So it's more of a pathology and an inevitability. But I also think that I'm not the only one that has it. And people read in this way. Reading is not a linear activity that you start from A and finish to Z. And especially now with the density of information that's coming through different media, the attention span of a regular reader is less than 300 words, like maybe 250 words. So people, the minds of audiences shift from point to point. And I think I was trained in both traditions, like close reading, but also kind of hopping, because that's what we all do. So the question becomes, what becomes of scholarship and of knowledge and of thinking about important ideas in the field when people think like that and read like that? And it's really, it's an important question to address, not just from me, but from, I guess, other people, because it's a fact right now. It's not something that scholarship has a very diminished audience, right? Like that's why I don't want to do my books with university presses, because I took that book to MIT Press and they said, great, we'll publish it in 2027. We'll do two double-blind peer reviews, which will be great because you've done the Oxford thing. And then we'll have to put the chapters in line. I'm like, no, I don't want to put the chapters in line. I don't think they should be in line because we don't rank like that. We don't think like that. And how to create thought processes and paths is important. I don't know what is next, but definitely not something that follows a line. Eva, you have to wait.
Yeah.
I have a book. Wait.
I thank
Not
you.
this
Thank you so much for your talk here. It's super interesting to hear about the density of this in like a very academic way, because I feel like ecology is something that is just like lived and it's just around us, and like the first thing that I think of when I hear ecology is like I think of the forest, like very natural based, and all the things around me that basically make the world what they are. So I've never actually saw it through the architectural lens. I'm just like, I don't even have like a specific question. It's more that the way you talk about it is extremely, how do you say, encouraging to kind of like go through the world and like rethink all of these systems that are implemented around us. at the same time, this sense of like belonging in like a community, you know, like in a system, intellectually, physically, whatever, is also kind of a fundament of being, maybe. So if we're gonna, like, it's crazy to think how this is going to be in the future, that if we implement those, you know, ecological thoughts and new ways, there will be no like, how do you say, not just one line, but so many different lines, and like how would that even look like? Sorry, I actually don't have a question. I'm so overwhelmed with everything you just said.
It's a beautiful point. It's not a question. I don't want to answer. I think it's really beautiful to hear your perspective on hearing this material, and how it possibly or potentially helps you destabilize certain things that you were understanding of what ecology is. It's not a forest. The forest is a structure.
That's, yeah. Anyways, sorry, I thought I had a question, but actually
worry,
I don't. But thank you so much. It was really, really good.
Thank you. Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to make a short comment, very much related to what Carson and then Eva were speaking about or mentioning, but now the last, let's say, question or lack thereof helps me even more. No, I think, again, it's not a question so much, it's a comment, I guess. Perhaps the thing that has interested me more or stricken me more is the fact that you're using a very canonical even object, like a book that has linearity and that has a long history, and you're actually doing history in the sense of trying to account for things that have happened in a certain way. So there's a lot of hermeneutics in it, interpretive frameworks that you're developing, and you're developing all these concepts and shifting taxonomies to try to account for things that have happened. But paradoxically, or perhaps not so much, the result is precisely not to solidify specific linear narrative or a specific discourse or a specific way of seeing, in this case, or conceptualizing in our case, ecological design, but kind of proliferating possibilities. And so it's very much related to what you're saying, but it's also very much related to the way you were explaining how this was a cyclopedia for you as opposed to encyclopedia, right? To me, this is very, very interesting how you were able to put together very old concepts, but actualize them, you know, or allow us to read them from a more contemporary point of view, and also allowing us to be much more critical with certain mind frames and even concepts such as, let's say, sustainability or comfort or climate that have become pervasive and universal and nearly naturalized. No, so to me, what's really, really interesting is this proliferating use of hermeneutics, if you will. So interpreting in order to expand as opposed to, let's say, close and articulate in a strong and stable way knowledge. No? I think that's very important, especially in a design setting, right? Knowledge is particularly relevant when it allows us to invent more knowledge. So it allows us to think otherwise, and it allows us to
destabilize
exactly
and challenge,
exactly
dismantle assumptions.
But what's important to me is that there's a rigor to destabilization. I mean, you don't, you know, that's a very important question.
I am a historian, but I'm also a designer, and it was a very painful process for me to become a historian, having been a designer. So it's something that I owe to myself, I guess.
Well, the tension shows, and I think that's very, very interesting.
Thank you. But thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lydia, very much. I was also wanting to add up a little bit on the comments of Roger, Carson, Eva, and so on. And thank you for like this huge amount of work. And like I think like all this like complexity and layered kind of work, I think it's like a masterclass for all us other architects to like how to really embrace like ecological thinking, how to also giving us like a collection of ways of operating, and I think in an optimist kind of approach of like how we can embrace ecological thinking in a future, no? And also to think of other ways of thinking other than the like most common notions of sustainability, or the most like all these certificates. Like I always say, I think I tell my students, maybe some of them have heard about that, about on how on Masdar city in like of posters, in order to accomplish the LEED Platinum, they had to finish the works in a specific date that was during the Ramadan period, so the workers had to work for 24 hours without eating. So it's like so crazy that the fact that ecology needs to be intersectional, and it needs to, of course, have to take into account other things other than just pure technological, material, and these kind of things. No? So for us, I think it's like always so great to listen to your huge work on that, and like it gives us like a lot of inspiration for the future, and hope the students have like a lot of ideas after
Thank
this.
you, Maria. Thank you. Should we have a drink? Yeah. Yes.
Thanks a lot.